Hello and welcome to the Daily Brief, where we cut through the noise to bring you the most important news that move the markets. I'm your host Tarun, and in today's episode, we'll talk about 4 big stories. The first story is about the increase in imports of solar cells and modules from China. The second story is about an increase in bad loans in the microfinance space. The third story is about companies getting GST notices and what it means for FDI. And we finally talk about what's happening in China. Let's start by talking about the increase in imports of solar cells and modules from China. China and India have a love-hate relationship. One moment they are fighting and the next they are trying to make nice. While there's an insane amount of talk about diversifying supply chains, decoupling and China plus one, the reality is that both India and the world can't snap their fingers and reduce reliance on China. Nowhere is this more apparent than in solar panels. China is the biggest manufacturer of solar panels and the subcomponents. As much as the world wants to break up with China, it probably can't. Global carbon emissions continue to hit record highs, and the world has a short window to decarbonize. That means developing countries like India have to spend heavily on renewables like solar, wind, and nuclear. And right now, China dominates the global production of solar technology across everything, including the materials and components needed to make solar panels. There has been a lot of talk about manufacturing at home, but that hasn't translated to reality. From 2020 to 2025, India's solar imports from China have seen ups and downs. Imports dropped during COVID-19, then surged to 4.5 billion in 2022, with China supplying over 90%. Even in 2023, China's share of imports remained well over 90%. But in 2024, this dropped significantly to 56% for solar cells and 66% for modules as India ramped up its own production. But in the new financial year, this has gone back up. By the way, we are the third largest consumer of solar energy in the world. But why are we so reliant on them? Well, for one simple reason. Chinese solar panels are cheap. China invested heavily in solar manufacturing and now faces a massive overcapacity problem. It has so much spare capacity that it's dumping solar panels all over the world. Now, the Indian government has been trying to bring this down by putting in import restrictions and encouraging domestic production. They've mandated government solar projects to use solar products from approved Indian manufacturers. This rule was temporarily removed last year, but is now being reintroduced because India's local solar manufacturing capabilities have improved. According to the think tank ORF, India has the potential to become an alternative supplier of solar panels to China. There seems to be some good news because India has now started exporting solar products, especially to countries like the United States. The numbers are small, but it's a good sign nonetheless. Despite the potential, India has a long way to go. For one, India does not produce key raw materials needed for solar manufacturing, like polysilicon and wafers. Producing these materials is expensive and also requires technical expertise. By the way, on a funny note, Europeans are using solar panels as garden fences because China is flooding Europe with cheap panels because of its overcapacity problem at home. Let's move on to the second story, where we talk about the increase in bad loans in the microfinance space. We keep talking about loans. You are probably sick and tired of it, but we can't help it. There's a lot happening in the lending space, so please bear with us. But before that, let me set some quick context. Last Friday, Anurag spoke about how the RBI is concerned about the rapid growth of unsecured and personal loans. It is concerning that some people are borrowing to spend on basic necessities like food, energy, and shelter. The RBI governor mentioned that while the overall credit growth has moderated, certain personal loans are still growing fast, which needs careful monitoring. Some banks are seeing increased bad loans in their retail lending books. Like retail loans, even microfinance has been facing some challenges. Bad loans were rising in states like Tamil Nadu and West Bengal. RBL Bank and Kotak Mahindra Bank, which reported their earnings recently, pointed this out as well. Now, IIFL has published an interesting report on microfinance. Let me talk about a few things that stood out to me. There's rising stress in various segments, and a rising number of borrowers are struggling to pay back their loans. The situation has been steadily getting worse. This is not limited to some lenders, but seems to be across the board. Another interesting development is that usual practices like regular group meetings have not fully resumed. In microfinance, some lending happens in group settings because it increases accountability. Lenders typically organize meetings of borrowers to take stock of what's happening. This has made it harder for MFIs to collect payments and keep borrowers on track. Microfinance lenders are saying that the rise in bad loans is because of external factors like heat waves and elections. However, if you go by what the IIFL has to say, these reasons don't hold up. The real issue lies in how much people are borrowing. Borrowers are taking out loans from multiple lenders, often more than 5. This excessive borrowing, known as over-leveraging, is the root cause of the problem. As we've spoken about in Friday's episode, this problem is not limited to microfinance, but also to personal loans and other consumer loans. So what's happening? Is this just a temporary bump in asset quality for microfinance, or the start of something big? Now let's move on to the third story, where we talk about companies getting GST notices and what it means for FDI. Yesterday, Bajaj Finance, one of India's leading NBFCs, received a notice from the DGGI, or the Directorate General of GST Intelligence. The notice said that Bajaj Finance evaded tax worth 341 crores from June 2022 to March 2024. Let me briefly explain what happened. The DGGI claims that Bajaj Finance incorrectly categorized a service charge as an interest charge. The context here is that interest is exempt from GST. So this categorization allowed Bajaj Finance to avoid paying GST. The potential liability is not just the 341 crores. It includes a 100% penalty, 150 crore in interest, and a daily interest of 16 lakhs until payment is completed. Basically, Bajaj Finance, which has 3.54 lakh crores in assets under management, charges its consumer an upfront interest. The DGGI says that this upfront interest is actually a processing fee or service charge which should be taxable. I'll explain how this works. Let's say you want to borrow 100 rupees from a lender. The lender charges an upfront fee of 5% of the loan amount. So your total loan amount now becomes 100 plus 5, which is now 105. Essentially, in this case, the 5 rupee upfront fee is added to the loan amount. So you actually borrow 105 rupees instead of 100. And pay interest on the full amount over the lifetime of the loan. The DGGI stance here is that Bajaj includes a service fee in the 5 rupees but disguises it as an interest to evade taxes. This is because a service fee attracts a GST charge while an interest fee doesn't. If this interpretation holds true, the tax authorities are fair in their argument. But that's not the problem here. It has more to do with our country's complicated GST system, which may make it harder for businesses to operate freely. There are two ways to look at this. First is that India's GST systems are complicated to the extent that loopholes can always be found and exploited. The second is that India's GST systems need to be complicated because we are a diverse country. Regardless, incidents like what recently happened with Bajaj sends a negative message to the international investors about the ease and convenience of doing business in India. We discussed this in detail in the July 3rd episode, but I'll give you a quick recap in case you missed it. You see, our FDIs or foreign direct investments have fallen quite a bit lately. They were down almost 43% in 2023. Even though we are the 5th largest economy in the world, when it comes to FDIs, we rank 15th. In fact, lately, more money has been leaving the country than is coming in. Without investments, we cannot scale up manufacturing in the way we would ideally want to. In financial year 24, manufacturing was just 12.84% of our GDP, which is the lowest it has been in a decade. This means foreign investors aren't very confident about investing in India. A big highlighted concern is the risk of policies changing overnight and having retrospective implications. In simpler words, foreign investors are worried about a sudden rule or tax law changes that could not only penalize them in the future, but also cost them for the past. Something similar happened with Vodafone a few years ago. Interestingly, a very similar incident was recently in the news. Mahindra and Mahindra received a notice from the government in which they were questioned about the use of the Mahindra brand name by its various group companies. The tax authorities say that different subsidiaries of M&M should pay the main entity for the use of the brand name and logo, and a GST must be paid on it. While this sounds right in theory, it makes doing businesses in India harder. Companies and investors need to constantly live with the fear that something might suddenly come up and bite them. Broadly speaking, this is why FDIs in India have been decreasing, despite us being regarded as the next place to invest globally. So, if we have to attract global capital, we need to assure them of policy certainty. If rules keep changing and there's a fear of regulatory actions, investors will think twice before investing. And for the last story, let's talk about what's happening in China. The Chinese economy has many problems, as we've talked about before on this podcast. Its real estate sector, for one, is struggling. For a long time, the Chinese overinvested in real estate. People kept buying houses for most of the last decade, believing that house prices could never fall. Responding to this demand, property developers built more and more housing, often taking on large amounts of debt. A giant bubble formed. However, it popped during the COVID-19 pandemic, sending the country into disarray. This is perhaps the largest housing sector bust the world has ever seen, including the one during the 2008 global financial crisis. Of course, bad times don't last forever. Eventually, the crisis shall pass. Are we there yet though? A new Nomura report has some answers, but they aren't great for China. China's housing sector still has big problems. Most indicators are down since last year. Prices are falling month by month, with June's prices 0.85% lower than those from May. Almost 15% fewer new houses were sold this June than the last, and 1/5 fewer houses began construction than last year in June. China is caught in a bit of a vicious cycle, in fact. See, Chinese people aren't buying houses for many reasons. One, prices are steadily going down, and nobody likes buying something today that will be cheaper tomorrow. Two, many Chinese houses were pre-sold. That is, people paid money to buy houses before they were actually constructed. Unfortunately, in many cases, the actual houses were never delivered. In fact, the delivery of 20 million pre-sold houses has been delayed. 3. Chinese local governments have been cash-strapped ever since the crisis. They've cut down how people pay, which makes them reluctant to invest in a house. Now, because people aren't buying houses, house prices are falling even further. As prices fall, builders are finding it increasingly difficult to find money to complete their construction work. As a result, the delivery of even pre-sold houses is getting stuck. Local governments make a lot of their money from private property developers. As property developers get stuck with unfinished projects, local governments' revenues are drying up. All of this, once again, is pushing people away from buying houses. This is a big problem for China. Its government is scrambling to make things better. Its current focus, quite wisely, is to ensure that all pre-sold houses are delivered. But solving the problem will take a lot of patience. Meanwhile, there are many new problems that could derail China's attempts. Large investors aren't putting money into China's capital markets. This is partly because many companies are withdrawing their IPO applications voluntarily due to regulatory issues. As a result, equity financing is no longer a financing option that Chinese firms are considering. Onshore equity financing dropped by more than 75% year on year between January and May this year. Many Chinese finance professionals have been laid off or have even seen their salaries cut. This further fuels its housing problems. A lot of this money, which would have gone into IPOs, is instead going to Chinese government bonds, which has led to a crash in the yields of Chinese government bonds. This massive demand for bonds shows that people aren't very optimistic about China's future. Two, as Chinese government bonds become more expensive, a lot of people are investing money in American bonds instead. This is the Chinese version of the carry trade, given that American bonds are yielding more than Chinese bonds. Chinese local governments are hiking taxes and fees for their services and are getting more zealous in enforcing tax laws. This money ultimately comes from the pockets of ordinary Chinese people, unfortunately making them less likely to make big investments in houses. And that's it for today's episode. We'll see you in the next one.